The body was found before sunrise, face down, West 133rd Street, 1 block from the Numbers parlor he'd run for 11 years. No gunshot wounds, no blade marks, no signs of struggle. Just a man, dead on frozen concrete. And everyone in Harlem knew exactly who had arranged it. What they didn't know was who he had called first. His name was Stax Johnson, a mid-level numbers operator who'd made one fatal mistake. He had started skimming from the wrong man's territory. Not just any man. The man the Italian families called the only Negro we respect. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to every soul north of 110th Street as Bumpy. But here is what the street never fully understood about that morning. Bumpy Johnson had not sent his own men. The muscle that removed Stax from the living world had driven up from downtown, from Italian Harlem, from the network of enforcers that answered to the Luciano and Genovese crime families, men who owed Bumpy Johnson not loyalty, but debt. This was not gang violence. This was franchise management. And Stax Johnson was not the first black rival eliminated this way. He would not be the last. Because Bumpy had constructed something that no one in American organized crime had attempted before him, he had turned the most powerful white criminal organization in the country into an instrument of black territorial dominance. This is how he did it. Harlem in the 1920s was not one city. It was two. Above the surface, jazz clubs, church steeples, the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes reading poetry, Duke Ellington selling out the Cotton Club. Below it, a parallel economy, invisible to downtown, ungoverned by any precinct that actually cared. The numbers racket ran through every barbershop, every laundromat, every tenement hallway. Millions of dollars, weekly, untaxed, unprotected, and entirely controlled until Bumpy arrived by Stephanie St. Clair, the Madame Queen, a Martinique-born woman who would build Harlem's underground with nothing but arithmetic and nerve. Bumpy Johnson arrived from Charleston, South Carolina in 1919. 14 years old, quiet, observant, already hardened by a childhood that had given him nothing except the understanding that power respects only power. St. Clair recognized something in him immediately. She didn't hire muscle. She hired a student. For a decade, Bumpy watched how money moved in Harlem, who collected, who skimmed, who was protected by which precinct captain, and at what weekly rate. He mapped the entire organism before he ever touched it. That education would later make him the most dangerous man the Italian families had ever negotiated with, not because he was violent, because he was precise. In 1931, downtown came to Harlem, not with diplomacy, with force. Dutch Schultz, the Bronx-born Jewish gangster who had already swallowed half of Manhattan's illegal liquor trade, decided the Harlem numbers racket was his next acquisition. He sent collectors, then enforcers, then threats delivered directly to Stephanie St. Clair's door. Most operators surrendered immediately. Bumpy Johnson declared war. What followed was 18 months of open street conflict. Bombings, disappearances, bodies left in lots between Amsterdam Avenue and Lenox. The NIP he'd watched with deliberate indifference. Downtown violence was a police problem. Harlem violence was simply weather. Bumpy survived 3 assassination attempts in 8 months. Each one made him more dangerous. Not angrier, more calculated. But survival alone could not win this war. Schultz had infrastructure Bumpy couldn't match. Distribution networks, corrupt judges, political insulation reaching into City Hall itself. So Bumpy made a decision that would define the next 30 years of Harlem's underworld. He went to Lucky Luciano, not as a subordinate, not with a plea. He arrived with a proposition, structured, specific, and mutually profitable. Harlem generated enormous numbers revenue. That revenue needed laundering infrastructure only the Italian families possessed. In exchange for Luciano's protection against Schultz, Bumpy would deliver a fixed percentage of Harlem's earnings and maintain order himself. Luciano accepted. Dutch Schultz was dead within 4 years, murdered by the commission he had threatened to destabilize. Bumpy had not pulled the trigger. He never needed to. Most men who make arrangements with the Italian families become subordinates. Bumpy Johnson became something else entirely. The agreement with Luciano was never written, never witnessed. It existed in the only currency the underworld genuinely respects: consistent delivery. Every week, without interruption, Harlem's percentage moved downtown. Precise, punctual, never short. Bumpy understood something fundamental about criminal partnerships that most operators never grasped. Reliability is more valuable than loyalty. Loyalty is emotional. Reliability is structural. And structures last. Within 3 years of the Luciano arrangement, Bumpy had done what no black organized crime figure in American history had previously accomplished. He had converted Italian enforcement capacity into a personal instrument. When a rival emerged in Harlem, a competing numbers operator, a hijacker cutting into protected routes, an ambitious young criminal testing boundaries, Bumpy didn't mobilize his own crew first. He made a phone call downtown. What arrived was deniability wrapped in Italian muscle. The message received on Harlem streets was deliberate and precise. This man has reach you cannot touch. But the arrangement carried a hidden weight that Bumpy understood from the beginning. Every favor requested created an obligation recorded. Every enforcement action performed by Genovese muscle was a debt-accumulating interest. He was not borrowing power. He was mortgaging Harlem. The question was never whether the Italians would eventually demand full payment. The question was how long Bumpy could delay that moment and what he would sacrifice to do it. By the mid-1940s, Bumpy Johnson was not simply a criminal. He was an institution. Harlem's political infrastructure, its ward captains, its precinct commanders, its city council relationships, ran through him the way electricity runs through copper. Invisibly. Necessarily. Without interruption. He understood something that pure gangsters never grasp. Street power without political insulation is merely violence, waiting to be prosecuted. But political insulation without street power is theater. The combination of both creates something genuinely ungovernable. Bumpy built both simultaneously. He cultivated relationships with Harlem's legitimate leadership with the same precision he applied to criminal logistics. Community figures, church pastors, civil rights organizers who needed neighborhood peace to operate. He funded funerals for families who couldn't afford them, distributed turkeys on Thanksgiving, settled disputes that the police refused to touch. This was not generosity. This was governance. Downtown recognized it. The Genovese family understood that Harlem under Bumpy was stable, profitable, and self-regulating. A precinct commander causing problems for numbers operations would find his career complications arriving through channels he couldn't trace back to any criminal complaint. Washington eventually noticed too. The FBI opened a file on Bumpy Johnson in 1943. Not because he was violent, because he had constructed what their internal memorandums described as a parallel administrative structure within a major American urban district. They weren't describing a gangster. They were describing a shadow government. And shadow governments, history demonstrates consistently, are only dismantled through one of two methods: overwhelming external force or internal betrayal. Federal pressure changes the architecture of criminal organizations the way water changes stone. Slowly. Then suddenly. Between 1944 and 1952, Bumpy Johnson served 3 separate federal sentences. Narcotics charges. Each conviction carefully constructed by a government that couldn't touch his political infrastructure directly, so instead dismantled his physical presence. Remove the man from the street long enough, and the network he built begins redistributing itself. That was the calculation. It was partially correct. While Bumpy sat in Alcatraz, and later Danbury Federal Penitentiary, Harlem did not collapse, but it fragmented. Mid-level operators who had existed under his authority began testing boundaries. New faces emerged. Competing structures formed in the vacuum his absence created. The Italian families watched this fragmentation with professional interest. A unified Harlem under Bumpy was a reliable partner. A fragmented Harlem was an acquisition opportunity. When Bumpy returned to the streets, he discovered that the arrangement which had once elevated him now constrained him. The Genovese family had quietly established direct relationships with several operators who had grown powerful during his imprisonment. His allies had become their contacts. His network had developed alternative loyalties. The tool he had once operated, Italian enforcement capacity directed at black rivals, was now a mechanism that other people had learned to use. And some of those people were using it against the very operators Bumpy considered his own. The instrument had found new hands. Bumpy Johnson's response to fragmentation was not panic. It was taxonomy. He categorized every operator who had grown during his imprisonment into three groups: those who could be reabsorbed, those who could be neutralized through political pressure, and those who required permanent removal. The third category was handled with a methodology that had defined his entire criminal architecture. He never touched them directly. The process was clinical, a conversation downtown, a debt referenced, a specific name mentioned with specific geography attached. Within days, sometimes hours, the problem would resolve itself through mechanisms entirely disconnected from Harlem's streets. No Harlem witnesses, no Harlem weapons, no Harlem fingerprints. Italian efficiency. Black territorial result. Stax Johnson, whose body opened this story, belonged to that third category. A mid-level operator who had expanded aggressively during Bumpy's Alcatraz years. Built his own collection network across 4 blocks of prime Harlem territory. Refused 2 separate requests to return those blocks to Bumpy's structure. He made the fatal miscalculation of believing that Bumpy's imprisonment had permanently diminished his reach. The car that followed Stax home on the night of February 1952 carried no one from Harlem. The men inside spoke no English among themselves. They left no evidence that any American law enforcement agency ever successfully prosecuted. But every operator remaining in Harlem understood the message with absolute clarity. Bumpy Johnson had not weakened during his years inside federal walls. He had simply been waiting for the invoice to mature. The eliminations worked. For approximately 4 years. By 1956, Harlem's numbers operation had reconsolidated under Bumpy's authority. Competing structures had either collapsed or reintegrated. The fragmentation that federal imprisonment had created was methodically reversed. But the world surrounding that reconsolidation had fundamentally changed. Heroin had arrived, not gradually, like an occupation. The same Italian distribution networks that Bumpy had leveraged for territorial enforcement were now flooding Harlem with narcotics at a scale that made numbers revenue look irrelevant. The Genovese family, and later the Lucchese and Bonanno organizations, had identified black urban neighborhoods as their primary retail market. Bumpy's arrangement had an unforeseen structural consequence he could not reverse. By legitimizing Italian presence in Harlem through decades of cooperative criminal enterprise. By making downtown families comfortable operating north of 110th Street, he had inadvertently constructed the distribution infrastructure that would now devastate the very community he governed. The enforcers he had borrowed became the suppliers nobody could expel. He spent his final years in a Harlem that was physically familiar but spiritually unrecognizable. The jazz clubs remained. The church steeples remained. But the streets below them carried a different current now, one that moved not numbers' slips, but poison. Bumpy Johnson died of heart failure on July 7, 1968, inside Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. Harlem, New York. He was 62 years old. He died at a table surrounded by neighbors, a man who had ruled through distance, finally at the end, sitting completely still among ordinary people. History remembers Bumpy Johnson as Harlem's protector. The record suggests something more complicated. He was a man who identified the most powerful instrument available to him and used it with genuine brilliance. He outmaneuvered Dutch Schultz. He negotiated with Lucky Luciano as an equal. He built a shadow government inside America's most scrutinized black neighborhood and maintained it across 4 decades. But every instrument leaves marks on the hand that holds it. The Italian families didn't conquer Harlem through force. They were invited in, strategically, necessarily, brilliantly, by the one man powerful enough to have kept them out. Bumpy Johnson didn't lose Harlem in a war. He traded it, piece by piece, for the weapons he needed to win smaller battles. And when the trading was finished, when the debts were settled and the rivals eliminated, Harlem remained. But it belonged, in ways no street negotiation could ever fully reverse, to the arrangement he had constructed. The most dangerous deals are never the ones made under threat. They are the ones made freely by brilliant men who believed they could control what they had unleashed.